Okay, everybody, here we go. Last one.
First, on behalf of the University of Arkansas and the TEX program, thank you for agreeing to meet with us and take your time to talk to us about Tibet and what you do. Our first couple questions are more personal questions, so can you tell me your name and your age?
My name is Tenzin. I am probably 36 years old.
Okay.
So,
Where were you born?
I was born in Tibetan settlement in the southeast part of Tibet. Southeast part of India. It's a state called Orissa.
Okay. Did your parents come over from Tibet?
Yes, they did.
What part of Tibet are they from?
They were part of from a very remote area bordering Bhutan, a place called Dokar, which is in the district of Thoka, central Tibet.
Do you know what your parents used to do in Tibet, like what they worked in?
They did a lot of things, like what the Tibetans call samadrop, which means they were both nomads and peasants. At the same time, my father was a soldier as well. So, great combination.
Yeah.
A peasant, a nomad, and a soldier. And that's what they did.
Okay. Do you know how they got from Tibet to India?
Well, they, like most Tibetans, my father was obviously a Tibetan soldier, so he knew the conditions. And so they heard the Chinese occupation of Tibet. And then they heard the fleeing of his Holiness Dalai Lama. So then they thought, let's follow his orders. But obviously my father was involved in a lot of political revolutionary activities. He was put in jail as well for helping out some of the Tibetans who were fleeing Tibet. But unfortunately there was one Tibetan who was part of the Communist Party member. So through his help he was able to flee his prison as well.
Okay. Can you tell us what you do here in Tibet, like where you work?
I do research work at the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy. I do, like all researchers, I write, I read, I translate, and I talk to people about Tibet. And I try to bring an alternative story about Tibet, something different from the mainstream. That's my challenge.
When was the center started?
I think the center was first part of the Central Tibetan Administration, which is the Tibetan government in exile. And then later on it became an NGO, probably in early 2000s, I'm not really sure. Mm-hmm. But as far as I'm concerned, I've been working in the center for the last almost 3 years.
Okay. Where did you go to school at here in India in order to become a research officer?
I grew up, as I said, in the Tibetan settlement of Orissa. So I attended my school, my formative school there, up until the 10th standard. And then I went to another Tibetan refugee school in the capital of Himachal Pradesh, which is called Simla, where I finished my +1 and +2. And then I went to Delhi University. I studied political science for 3 years. Then I also went to a Tibetan college in Sara, which is very close from here. And I also had a chance to study in the US as well, in Wyoming.
Okay. Do you think your education in the Tibetan settlements gave you a lot of information about the Tibetan culture?
Not in the schools. Schools there's a lot of propaganda, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. But most of my education, as you put it, the stories that I think I got it from my parents and from the Tibetan community. The older generations out there. And the great thing about them is that when they tell a story, they don't tell it as if they're educating us. It's just a random conversation.
Okay.
But in school, it's kind of more of fun.
How did you become involved with the Center for Human Rights and Democracy?
Well, before that, I worked in the Kashak, which is the Tibetan cabinet, and then due to several reasons, I had to resign. And then I tend to have a very independent attitude. That's why, sometimes you often bump against people in power. So I resigned and then I started working But one good thing about me is that I can easily sort of, I know Tibetan language and English quite well. And this is quite important right now because English has a far-reaching effect, right? But at the same time, if you want to know about Tibet, you need to know Tibetan language as well. Because ultimately it's about Tibetan struggle, Tibetan voice. So I think I was quite fortunate in that sense. And my director was quite a smart, intelligent woman, so she just picked me up.
Some more questions about the center itself and your work. What are some of the human rights abuses committed by the Chinese against Tibetans?
I think lots of terrible human rights abuses. I think the biggest, the most terrifying, the terrible abuse is the fact that the Chinese government doesn't believe in the what I call right to conscientious kind of ideas. And it's not like you see inside Tibet people are not like engaging in violence. They sing a song about Tibetan culture, and Tibetan identity, and Tibetan voice, and they are being put in prison. And I think that's the most terrible thing. Probably North Korea might be something like that, human rights violation. I think as a human you should be able to sing, right? Singing song is not a crime.
Right.
And but the bad thing is that if you try to crush people's conscience, then you're going to have a backlash. So you see all these self-humiliations happening. So I think for the Chinese, I think they really need to think about what they are doing in Tibet. So that's the crushing of the conscience.
Why do you think China wants to do that, to crush the consciousness?
Because for the Chinese, and especially for the Communist Party, the rise of Tibet, the rise of Tibetan consciousness is an existential threat. And also for the Chinese economy, Tibet is absolutely a must. So they're always scared, that Tibet might go its own way, despite all the assurances by His Holiness, right? Through his non-violence and peaceful dialogue. The Chinese are so scared of human conscience. I don't know why. Something that Chinese themselves, as a people, in a great nation, they have to look deep into themselves for their own interests. And I think if they let Tibet and have their own, sort of voice, I think it will be good for the Chinese. And if they care about freedom.
Okay, let it rip.
Good. So speaking of a specific human rights violation, can you tell us a little bit about the nomad resettlement that's occurring in Tibet?
Yeah, that has to do with what the Chinese call urbanization, the rise of Chinese economy. And they want to sort of settle all the nomads in permanent housing, sort of places. And but it's a big violation of the nomadic life. Basically, the Chinese need the nomadic lands. The nomadic lands, as my research has found out, has a lot of minerals under it. So they want to kick out the nomads. But the problem is that the nomads do not have an alternative source of livelihood. Because if you want to participate in Chinese economy, you need to know Chinese, right? The nomads don't know the Chinese. So what happens is that they are robbed of their own traditional livelihood. They are put in concrete houses. And they are given some Chinese toys, that is Chinese TV, and a bit of compensation. And the money runs out, and since they have no other livelihood, so if you watch movies like The Old Dog, the nomads end up suffering from cultural alienation. And I think this is I think it's a crime against humanity.
And why do you think that the international community doesn't recognize the nomads as internally displaced?
I don't know. I'm not really happy with this word, internally displaced people, because it's quite manipulated in my sense. It connotes as if Tibet is just an internal matter of China. I think Tibetan problem is more complex than that. It needs to look at through a different perspective. So in one sense, I'm not really sort of bothered about the international community not recognizing nomads as internally displaced people. But at the same time, they need to sort of put pressure. If they have the capability to put pressure on China, because given the rise of Chinese economy, because if they keep on doing allowing this kind of destruction of nomadic life, then there's going to be a lot of violence. You see, some of the self-emulators, they were nomadic women. They were self-emulating both inside Tibet and in Beijing as well, protesting against the land grabs of the nomadic people. So I'm sure international community cares a lot about peace and justice, right? So they need to talk to the Chinese leadership. Yeah, that's what it is.
For the Tibetans, what types of conditions do they face?
In the prison?
Yes.
Yeah, it's terrible, you know. I think it's a lot of torture. I really don't want to go delve into detail into that, you know. Beatings, electrocution. And but the worst thing is that they keep on beating the Tibetans to say something that they don't believe in. And again, it comes back to the crushing of the conscience. So what's the point? So that's like really, really horrible. And but there's lack of press freedom in China. If the Chinese people know what the CCP is doing to the Tibetan people, I think they'll be shocked, you know, because every human has a conscience. And I think also the international community needs to look into that. You know, because if you torture people who express their own, you know, ideas, you know, if they sing a song, if you torture them, then what is the ultimate, right? You know? So this is something that we have to think about. If we really care about human consciousness, not just talking about Tibetan nationalism, right? Just as a basic human kind of condition.
Have the conditions gotten worse for political prisoners?
I mean, the conditions has always been terrible. If you look at the, based on even Chinese statistics, economic statistics, Tibet, of all the Chinese provinces, is the worst in terms of health, education, you know, reproductive kind of, you know, conditions. So despite like almost 60 years of Chinese occupation, Tibet is the worst place. And obviously that's what the Chinese consider Tibet as, something that needs to be exploited. A barbarian place, you know. It's not very beautiful, the Chinese, but they need the Chinese land, the minerals, and also for geostrategic reasons. So the conditions, obviously, not just the political prisoners, they are the role models, you know, they are speaking up. But for the ordinary people, it's just terrible. You know, the conditions, the poverty, the lack of education, and basically robbing of their own sort of identity and history, and basically it's a kind of, as you said, a culture of genocide. But then there has been a lot of resistance as well. It's not all like gloom and doom. It's not entirely hopeless.
We went to the Tibet Museum right before this, and I was reading about the patriotic re-education that China's doing with young Tibetans. What are the implications of that?
I think it's very painful, you know. As again I said, in this patriotic education is like a joke, you know. I'll tell you an example, a story that a young Tibetan wrote, you know, at a great risk. You know, he said the Chinese, you know, the patriotic education is very interesting. You know, they try to reward the monasteries who they think are very patriotic. So there's one monastery, and the Chinese started rewarding them, promoting them as models of high patriotism. But one day, you know, they found that there was some problem. You know. They found that the leader of the monastery was not very patriotic, so they started arresting all of them, started questioning them, bringing them all to the Chinese detention center. So the monastery was empty. So on the walls of the monastery, you have all these patriotic literatures, the propaganda literatures, you know, pasted. And so when the monastery was empty, a Tibetan goat, you know, entered the monastery and started eating all the, you know, literatures, all the papers. So what does he mean by that? It's actually that, you know, even the goat, you know, doesn't like the patriotic education. So it's like a kind of, you know, I mean, just a wastage of time for the Chinese themselves, wastage of money. You know. So why they are doing that? So that's what I'm saying, you know, freeing the Tibetans is actually freeing the Chinese themselves. They need to know that. I mean, it doesn't benefit both the Chinese and the Tibetans themselves to do such kind of nonsense. But it doesn't work. Right? They've been doing this patriotic education for the last 50 years. It never worked. It never worked.
Do you think
if they want to really do the patriotic education, then they have to do it for like almost 5,000 years. Because Tibetans as a civilization, as a people, has been, you know, it was founded almost like 5,000 years ago. The idea of Tibet, or Tibetan, was first founded in almost in the 5th, 6th century. So the CCP has to go through that kind of process of re-educating them for centuries and centuries. So,
So do you think should Tibet receive independence or become an autonomous region, that what has been done and what abuses that have been committed can be, I guess, rectified?
yeah, I mean, the question is not whether Tibet should become more independent. The question is, can the Tibetans find out ways to become independent? Can they have the capability? Can they have the ideas and imagination? I'm talking about true independence. That benefits both the Tibetans and the Chinese and other people as well. That's what true independence is all about. And the Tibetans have done it in the past, they can, but they need to go through a lot of struggles, I think. Not just confronting the Chinese, but also some internal sort of reforms as well. And I think it's a huge, huge challenge.
Why do you think Tibetans are self-immolating as often? Why is it not as successful as it is in other areas of the world?
I think, as far as Tibet is concerned, the Tibetan people are, there's this kind of stereotype, that is going on. Is that Tibetan people are very peaceful, and so that's why people were surprised when they saw that. But if you really and honestly look at Tibetan history, it's not like that. Tibetans are a civilization, and it's a complex, like all civilizations, it's complex, right? And violence and armed resistance is part and parcel of it. So I wasn't surprised. But the self-immolation is actually the manifestation of the culmination of Tibetan non-violent resistance. I was very impressed, and I think it's absolutely true when the Kirti Rinpoche, the head of the Kirti monastery, when he described the way he described the self-immolation, he said this is Tibetan Buddhist intifada. So I think it's a form of resistance, and I think, and before that, Tibetans had guerrilla wars against the Chinese as well, right? So it's a form of resistance, and it's happening because as a part of non-violent movement. The self-immolators could sort of take some Chinese with them as well. Right? They didn't do it. Right? You have to ask this question, and it's because thanks to great leaders like His Holiness, it's a great restraining factor on Tibet. So it's a non-violence, and unfortunately in the media, people tend to focus more on ISIS. People like violence more than non-violence. So maybe you should ask the media themselves why you are not covering it, right? And so that's my point.
What happens to the family members of self-immolators?
Oh yeah, it's the Chinese have a collective punishment. Right? One of the husbands of self-immolator is currently serving a death sentence. This is the extreme example. The Chinese themselves pass a law, which criminalizes all the people who show any kind of solidarity to the self-immolators. Even if you light a butter lamp to the self-immolator, you'll be put in prison and punished. There's this collective punishment. But this is not working. It shows more kind of resentment in the heart of the Tibetan people. So I don't know what the Chinese leadership, are doing. They need to sort of revise their policy. But I don't think, as a researcher, I think following the Chinese politics, the Communist Party, they don't have the capability to sort of what we call re-examine and self-reflect. I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party.
Do you think that the Chinese Communist Party is likely, or?
I don't know. There's a crisis in the Chinese Communist Party itself, right? The Chinese themselves do not believe and trust the Communist Party. They're joining it because they get a lot of benefits out of it, right? So I don't know how long these lies will continue. Can a society exist on lies, on propaganda? So I really don't know. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think lies can sustain, but I could be wrong. Who knows? But the bottom line is that it's not benefiting. The Chinese Communist Party spends more on internal security than on external security. So they face the threat from the Chinese themselves is kind of more acute to the Chinese Communist Party than the outside world. So that speaks volumes about the condition and the nervousness of the Chinese Communist Party. So who knows? Let's see.
Right. Has like improved technology affected how Tibetans are treated as well, like surveillance or anything?
Yeah, in terms of surveillance, it's just terrible now. Now the Tibetans don't care about surveillance. It's like open defiance. You have monks, right, writing poems, opposing Chinese Communist Party policies and sending the poems through their mobile phones, right, emailing it to the Chinese Communist Party leaders and getting themselves jailed. So the surveillance is not working. The spies and surveillance, it's just an open defiance.
Sorry. Are there any other ways that China is repressing like religious expression for Tibetans in Tibet?
I think one thing that the outside world, right, those who care about Tibet and Tibetan politics and the struggle, they need to know is that Tibetan polity, Tibetan struggle is closely intertwined with Tibetan religion. Before the Tibetans lost their independence, Tibet had a state called Chusi Sungdre in Tibetan, which means like a combination of religion and politics. So His Holiness is both the political and the religious leader of Tibet. So when when they ban His Holiness's picture, he's not banning a picture of a religious leader. It has political implications. So in that sense, the Chinese are like really cracking down on the monasteries. Right? They are targeting the monasteries. And one of the Chinese Communist parties called the monasteries as the fountainhead of separatism, that is independence. And they drew an analogy. They said like, in order to kill the serpent, you need to crush the head, which means like you need to crush the religious expression, the monasteries. So it's like rampant inside Tibet. Because that has to do with, as I said, Tibetan political struggle. And so yeah, they are targeting the monasteries. And I'll give one example. In the government building, in the government spaces inside Tibet, right? Like the CCP headquarters or like the Tibetan universities, the monks are not allowed to go there, wearing red robes. It's like an apartheid, So I think this is my request, not to sort of look at religious persecution simply as a religious persecution. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. So, are young Tibetans allowed to become monks or nuns, or is that kind of disapproved of by China?
I mean, they do. The Chinese have, but they have put on a cap. There are some limits. Obviously, the Chinese cannot totally sort of close off the monasteries, shut down, because at the same time the monasteries bring a lot of tourism. But the Chinese is like a tourist show. But there's no real open sort of discussion of philosophical ideas. And, so inside Tibet, in the monasteries, you'll see lots of monks who have not registered officially. They try to live near the monasteries and try to learn it. And every time there's a problem, they'll be like cracked down and they'll be kicked out. And there's a real sort of persecution of Tibetan religious folks. And China is like really scared, because Tibetan Buddhist philosophy as an idea is a big threat to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. I'll give you one example of Tenzin, a famous Tibetan Lama from Eastern Tibet, who is now serving life in prison. And his assistant, his cousin, was executed by the Chinese because they were accused of causing some bombings in Chengdu, which is absolutely nonsense. So why they are like killing them and putting them in life in prison? Because he is very charismatic and he is doing a lot of charity work. He's very honest, and he has opened up schools not just for the Tibetan students but to the Han Chinese students as well. So the people are started trusting the charity work of the Lama, and then they try to compare it with the corruption of the Chinese Communist Party. So that kind of threat. So that's why it's a big threat to the CCP.
A lot of the government in exile's work here in India has been about like preserving Tibetan culture. Are there any movements within Tibet to do the same?
Inside Tibet, I mean, thanks to sometimes inside Tibet, the Chinese themselves kind of not promote, but out of accident. Because, like for instance, I'll tell you, in order to sort of propagate the Chinese ideas, about Chinese Communist Party's ideas and about Chinese Constitution, they have to translate, all those documents into Tibetan. So in the process, they had to sort of co-opt and had to provide some space for Tibetan literature. Otherwise, they can't run the show, right? But then also inside Tibet, the resistance is so powerful, right? Because of the great leaders in the past, like Tenzin Lama. And Tenzin Lama was he was not a member of the Chinese Communist Party, but he was a Lama, and he had a lot of respect from the people. So he was very powerful. So he was able to negotiate with the Chinese to open up schools and and then but yeah, from the government side, there's no funding. The schools are really poor. For them, the Tibetan language has no use. So it's more of a kind of self-initiative, Now you see inside Tibet with the rise of the Hakar kind of movement, even like old Tibetan Amalas, like 80-year-old Tibetan women trying to learn Tibetan after that. So it's a kind of self-initiative movement. And then we hear all of a sudden stories like, of Tibetan monk activists and non-activists being sort of put in prison for trying to sort of build Tibetan schools. And then you can also look at the example of the famous monastery in Serthar, in Kham, by Khenpo Jigme Phuntsep. Initially the Chinese kind of allowed, because and then many Chinese students started joining the school, and it started expanding. It's doing really well, really benefiting the Chinese as well. Then the CCP sort of struck it down. So the self-initiatives are coming in, but the Chinese sort of crushed them.
So those who self-initiate the cultural preservation, it's a risky decision to do so? Or?
Yeah, it's quite difficult. It's quite difficult. It's quite risky. Not just risky, but then there's no sort of support, in terms of logistics and if you want to start a school, you need support, right? You need money and you need support from the government and from the society. It's quite difficult.
Jumping around again, how common is it for people to die in detention when they're being held for whatever crime China charges them with?
We have had a few cases of political prisoners dying in prison because of so much excessive beatings. But the Chinese have found out a way out. They have found a strategy. Obviously, beating is the norm. Suppose if you protest, immediately you'll be knocked off. You'll be beaten and dragged to prison, and you'll be beaten again and again. And then the Chinese, what they do is sometimes when they realize that this guy is going to die in the prison, they'll just release him under what they call medical parole. So, but yeah, we have found some cases.
So by doing that, does China hope to avoid disapproval from either people within China or the international community by putting them on medical parole so they don't die with them?
Yeah, I mean they sort of they're scared, because if prisoners die in prison, there'll be a lot of pressure, So they just the Chinese have a problem what they call face saving, especially CCP care a lot about face, and they always try to show nice things. So they always try to avoid the ugly side of the CCP. And obviously dying in prison is a terrible thing.
How does the center utilize its information? What do they hope to use their information for?
I think our main sort of goal is actually to spread out information. Obviously that's what we have been doing, spreading it out to the media and to the outside world. But now we are also trying to sort of raise kind of consciousness within the Tibetan society as well. Because within the Tibetan society, I mean, Tibetan culture is complex, right? Tibetan resistance movement is complex, right? You have the monks, you have the secular intellectuals, you have the ordinary people. So I think we are trying to sort of bring in sort of different stories as well, and not to sort of like, we can't just like focus on one just story all the time. I mean, as I said, Tibet is complex, so we need to bring all those voices out as well.
How do you decide what information you share and what information you might not at the time?
Yeah, I mean, some sensitive information, obviously, we don't share it, but that depends upon the person providing the information. We had a case of a young Tibetan who was killed in prison. There's certain sensitive information that we couldn't reveal because the parents don't want to reveal. And yeah, we do have such kind of calls, but it depends upon the sources.
And what do you think is the most effective form of activism?
I think, as far as I'm concerned, first of all, you need to have a kind of an intellectual awakening. You need to understand what the problem really is. I think that's the first number one step. And obviously, you have to have an impeccable integrity, right? You need to have a lot of courage, because if you really resist, if you're really for independence, then you have to bump against not just the Chinese and non-Chinese, but also your own people sometimes. And so I think, yes, first, number one, intellectual kind of awakening, a lot of readings, it's your imagination, right? Without sort of like romanticizing and idealizing the struggle. I know it sounds kind of vague, but that's what young Tibetans should do.
Do you think young Tibetans within Tibet know about the Chinese and Tibet issue in like a holistic way?
I don't know what you mean by holistic way, but most young Tibetans know. Because inside Tibet it's very interesting, because if you are a Tibetan inside Tibet, so suppose if you go to Chinese school, and even if you don't go to Chinese school, you listen to the Chinese propaganda, right? So the Chinese propaganda about Tibet is basically Chinese-centric. They say, oh, Tibet has been part of motherland, the CCP has done so many good things. But when the same kids, when they go to home, the parents tell the reality, right? They pass on. Like in monasteries, you have like the lamas passing on their knowledge to the disciples. So in the ordinary lay people, they also hear all these stories. So they have this like a cognitive dissonance going on. And then they see the reality, right, out there. The open discrimination. That's what I heard from my research, talking to my Tibetan friends from inside Tibet. And then all of a sudden, because of the rise of technology, they find some great information. All of a sudden, they find a text, a Tibetan text. Suppose like the biography of His Holiness, My Land and My People in Tibetan, which is banned in China. They read this, and then that sort of like inspires them. So that's how they sort of, So I hope they will have a well-rounded sort of idea of it.
I'm going to jump around again. Sorry for that. How in Tibet, like environmental resources?
I think it's the big companies, now coming inside Tibet. I'll give you one example, the laptop, Now all these laptops are made in China, right, produced in China. And one of the raw materials that goes into making the laptop, the lead and the copper, is actually extracted from inside Tibet. So as I said before, there's a lot of minerals in the nomadic areas. So they kick out the nomads, they dig out the land. So what happens when you dig out the land? It leaves behind a lot of poisonous kind of thing, and that pollutes the river. And we had a lot of stories about, the local people being affected by the poisonous water. So what do the companies do? They come there and exploit, and then they go back to Beijing, right? So who suffers, right? And what is worse is that there's no Tibetan participation in the mining itself, right, in terms of like sharing resources. Even like really sort of peaceful protests are being sort of crushed. So I think it's a big problem.
How can young Westerners, like those of us here, bring more attention to like the environmental causes, but also just what's really happening in Tibet?
I think not just young Westerners. I think not in terms of Tibet as well, but in any kind of struggle. I think that includes me as well. We shouldn't sort of romanticize and idealize the struggle. Like for instance, in terms of like environmental sort of campaigning, there's a lot of romanticization going on now with the schools. We try to show that Tibetans kind of worship the mountains and then they don't sort of like exploit the minerals. That's not true. I mean, like when Tibet was empire, they exploited. They made a lot of arms. Even like the Buddhist monastic statues, where do they come from? Right? By exploiting the minerals. But that kind of romanticization is not going to work. It's not good for the people who are involved in the struggle because they're going to get disappointed, right? And people, we're all humans, right? I think that's something we should all keep in mind.
As someone who can, how do you handle the weight of the information that you're seeing on a day-to-day basis?
As far as I'm concerned, I try to sort of, as you said before, try to reach a kind of like really a holistic kind of conclusion. I don't immediately sort of spread the information. I think one of the biggest problems right now is this sensationalism, and that's not really helping in the long term. People today they find some information, they just publish it, and tomorrow they just forget it. So I think research is more than that. You need to, and also in terms of language, the kind of language that you use when you write a paper or when you speak to the media or to an audience. I think we should avoid all those jargon kind of things. Because this is not just a research thing, right? It's not just a think tank. This is involved with political struggle, right? So you need to have that language. I think these two things are, I think, very, and that's what I try to do. And that's what I try to tell people to do. But sometimes it's weird, I can't impose my ideas on them.
Do you think His Holiness will ever return to Tibet?
I don't know. I think it's both ways. I think he might and he might not. As far as my research and my ideas is concerned, it looks like sometimes I think he might return, or sometimes I know he might not return. It's always like this. So we don't know. And fortunately, he's quite healthy right now. We still have like many years for him to live. And if you look at, as I said before, the changing China, because the Tibetan struggle has also a lot to do with what's happening inside China. And the geopolitics, the rivalry between US and China. And all this needs to be taken into account. We just can't simply look at what's happening in Tibet. So yeah, in the end, sometimes I think he might, sometimes I feel he might not.
If you were given the opportunity to go to a free Tibet, would you?
Strange question, Yeah, of course, I mean, it's not about going, It's about when you go there and what kind of ideas you're going to implement there, Just putting, suppose if China leaves Tibet, you have whole Tibetan land in your arms, and just putting a Tibetan national flag is not enough, right? You've got to have vision on how to run the country. So we're not going to prosecute intelligent people, right? And if that happens, then it's just a fictional kind of independence. So it's not about, as I said before, whether you want independence. It's about how you're going to sort of run the whole country. In that sense, I always tell people you have to focus not just on politics, you have to focus on economy as well. Because economy is very important. You can't survive people all the time on politics and nationalism. All these things, and culture and literature and all these things. It's the challenge for the young Tibetans. And unfortunately, we are seeing lots of young educated Tibetans now going to big universities, learning economy, learning development, history, mathematics. Not just focusing on Buddhism. We have the great monasteries. So this is the vision of His Holiness, right? Not just the tradition, but the modern education as well.
I have one final question. What are your hopes for the future of Tibet?
I mean, to be honest, I don't, hope is something, it's good, but at the same time, it's very oppressive, But what I try to do is like, how to live my life, on a daily basis, The hope has to be sustained on a daily basis, right? But then what I meant is like, you just need to sort of think, and try to sort of empower yourself, right? And I think it's in the end it's a kind of I know it might sound very conservative, but it's kind of Puritan kind of effort. You should. I used to. If you like watching so much TV, you need to cut it down. Right? If you drink too much, you should cut it down. You have to find another sources of imagination. Like the example that I gave at the recently concluded Tibetan football tournament. I mean, everybody was enjoying football. That's great. At the same time, on the ground, there are lots of stories, inspiring stories going on. But if you only focus on sports, you won't see those stories, right? So you need to work on a daily basis. It's hard, I know. And I think that imagination, without sort of idealizing, right? First you need to recognize the reality, which is full of flaws. And then hopefully try to have a new imagination. Basically, then it's a human thing. Even if it's all tragedy, you should be able to see the comic side of the tragedy. So that's I think young people.
Okay. Thank you so much for meeting with us and being interviewed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Are you all behind? Where'd they go?
It's
Hot.
I felt bad.
It's okay.
Reflecting the sun on you. Oh, that's really good. That was wonderful.
What was the time? 41 seconds.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I take a picture with you? Is that a weird question?
Yeah, it's.
No question.
If it's not a selfie, then I'll.
No.
take it.
I was gonna have Allie take it with this camera.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was great to meet you. Thank you so much. And it ends as soon as the sun is behind the clouds. Not.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You did a great job.
Oh, thanks.
You did really, really good. Thank you.
Great job. Give it to the 기는 님들 그렇죠. 네.
아주 난 거기서 기계래.
아, 그래 주배. 그 알칸산스.
서로 기계지. 아니라 봐. 담론하잖아. 잡면 튀어. 아, 근데 저라 족두체. 그래서 컴퓨터는 디지털 로체. 아지마 마음 다이어노스. 야고 전화 들으려고 그런 날 해야 되는데. 안에 마음 치고 마음 observe 체. 그 프로세스 봐.
아, 기는 그게 런처팅.
And just na humanity course to humanity all that non-violent of the Indian Buddhism and Tibetan culture history and common Greek and Persian.
그게 거의 야는
무슨 그거 무슨 이제 그거 가만 기도가 아마 그렇게 빠질 안 하서 얘는 가슴
Yüzüyor yine bir serem ya.
네. 이런 거지. 사람 가네.
Mashed potatoes are my favorite thing.
I mean, that's the best part about potatoes.
But I just throw them all in there. I don't